Hey, Alex.
Hi, everybody.
It's good to see you. Let's say hi to Alex. Hey, everybody.
Good to see you.
Hey!
Oh, I have a
So,
delay. That's good.
Alex, it's great to have you here.
Do you
Thank
hear
you
me
very, very,
okay?
very much for joining us. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you for having me. Yep, I can hear you well. Can you hear me?
Okay. It's a little tinny, but we're going to get there. Alex,
Okay.
thanks for being here. I've told you a little bit earlier about what we're doing, and you're known as a world builder, one of the world's best world builders. In your words, what is that? What's a world builder?
Well, I think the primary framing of world building, because there's lots of interpretations of it, to me, world building is a design practice based on storytelling. And it's based on the idea of storytelling in an indigenous way, let's say, in the way in which we would understand the origin of storytelling, the idea that storytelling was formed to make sense of the world around us. So the world building aspect is that all aspects of the world are necessary to inform the story, to inform narrative. And then how you extrapolate forward from that is the world in which you are, the freedom you have to build a world, meaning a space that is holistic, that you can occupy, that can contain X number of stories, an infinite number of stories, really. So the world is this container for narratives ultimately, but it's one that's based in narrative design.
And so the narrative design, so it's quite interesting. You're most known for, at least if you Google you, for Minority Report, Fight Club, Charlie Chocolate Factory, but you've been doing some work recently, which I think is exciting you even more, which you were telling me just recently, telling me about some up in Canada and Wales and Ireland. Tell us a little bit about some of the work you're doing up in Canada.
Well, in Alaska,
Okay.
we were
Well,
asked, the
it's almost the same
Alaska,
place. It's almost the same place. Alaska, Canada, yeah, it's all up
generally,
there. Yeah, yeah, that's all right. Yeah.
yeah. The Alaska State Government Education Board asked us to look at a 30-year future of Indigenous education. And, this is a Western society that's traditionally betrayed the Indigenous education system, finally kind of asking the Indigenous people what they would imagine a 30-year future of education should look like for them. What we had the opportunity to do was to go into the tribal network and go community by community and do a series of gatherings that we call kalakas. The quick aside on that is that kalaka is an Eastern European word for barn building. So in this case, sort of the substance foundation of world building is that you can only build a world or the barn by all of the occupants, all of the villagers participating in building that barn. So the kalaka is going into each community, gathering people around the vision of where they consider education should go, adding this 30-year future extrapolation so that you can get beyond the near-term constraints and say, what if, all things being equal, this is the way it was working? How would you want it to work if this was your opportunity to build a new story? So we did that across multiple different tribes. There's 16 different languages, 120 tribes. We accessed a very small portion of those, but over a period of a year, and then built a website that gathered stories. So what we were doing in the end, and perhaps without even realizing it, we were creating a platform for voices that had never been heard and recording them. So that the website we built has 500 stories on it now, and each story is filtered by questions that were being asked by the tribes, completely curated by the tribes, very much about us just creating a platform for that to become self created and self-perpetuating by the tribes themselves. And so we ultimately build a kind of narrative base. And the other byproduct we discovered was that there had never been a network that allowed tribes to hear each other's stories, because there's 1,000 miles between some of those different communities. And so even though the global cultural narrative was very, very deeply 10,000 years established, the near-term day-to-day narratives were not understood from community to community. So you have this opportunity when you build a world to allow all the participants to enter that world in a democratic fashion, if you like. They all have equal access to all the narratives. And in every world that we build, that's true.
It's really cool. And so what has been the result of that? I'm just curious, what happened? You said it took a year to do. Are you still in the process, or what have they taken with that, and where is it gone?
Well, the brief was to create a report for the Alaska state government, which is what was derived from that. So the stories being told were turned into a very dry, kind of white paperish report that went back to the government. Our interest and hopefully the real outcome for us was that we did build this platform for storytelling that remains into the future as long as anybody wants it to run, just a gathering place. Every time somebody records a story, they can use video, audio, drawings, video, any photography, written narrative. Those all accumulate in that space. So that website is there and extant and available, and we've left it behind. And that was the idea, was that we would hand it over and step back. So it's been probably 6 months since we passed it on.
Yep, that's really cool, Alex. Thank you. And it's so interesting because that's quite different than the project with the schools around the world, which is also world building, as a methodology in which I'll just say, you just destroy everything so that they can rebuild. And here you're really with this project, I was just saying, with this project, you're trying to help make sure that this world doesn't get destroyed, their world doesn't get destroyed, which is so fascinating to me, which is the opposite of your method. Tell us about that.
Well, they both have exactly the same intent, which is to extrapolate forward and then thread back into the present. And from what you learn in that immersive, inclusive container of narrative story space in the future, you've gained a perspective on the present that you really don't get any other way. So when we're looking forward, we sometimes are 10, 20, 30, 70 years forward. The school project is called Junk. And the idea is, and junk is really equates to detritus. And the premise is, what if there was a civilization, what if there was a society 300 years in the future built on the detritus of a former civilization? We've got over a dozen schools in 4 continents working with that single sentence now as a premise. Probably 250, 300 students have been through this in the last 3 years. And so they have to, the provocation is you have to destroy the world. And then you have 300 years to rebuild it. But what we're really saying is you have to reconsider the narrative completely. You've got to assume that things are not going to continue as you know them. And in a way, it's a reaction to the problem I see, which is that every time we run into like this absolute disaster confronting us, there's always somebody who says, yes, but, all we have to do is stop using fossil fuels. So, okay, that's great. And everybody understands that. But what if we don't stop using fossil fuels? So we're saying, just imagine that things do not work out. What would you do? How would you imagine a future where you had an opportunity to completely reimagine, rethink the way in which you would build a society. And you're more likely to get a perspective on what you should do now by understanding what would happen if you don't do it in a very real way, in a completely immersive way. So when the students are building stories, they're building stories that have to go from the ground up. One of our key rules is that whatever way they decide to destroy the world, they've broken the infrastructure and there's no internet. So at the very base level, we are saying there's no fossil fuels because you can't access them. There's no long distance transportation. There's no airplanes. There's no internet. There's no banking. You have to reconsider economy, all of the social systems completely. And that's for the students, it's very disruptive because internet is the sort of ground, sort of the base point at which they build their future. So if you can say yes, but what if, then I think we get a perspective which is more useful than all we have to do is this and it's all going to be fine, which I think we all know is not the case.
So let's just follow with that for a moment. Are there some things which you've seen from some of the work with your students that has really surprised you that we might take as lessons for today, for us when looking forward? Because I think those in the room here don't want to destroy the village right now. That's
No,
not our,
no, absolutely.
yeah.
And I don't think, it is a provocation designed really to have a bunch of kids who have become complacent with their access to technology. The provocation is, let's set that aside. But I think we can do this in a number of different ways. The thing that I think becomes interesting at any level is to say, let's imagine, it's something you were saying earlier, Chris, is that if climate change creates a difference in terrain and the way in which landscape behaves, and therefore if the farming conditions are different, then your economy potentially changes radically. And if that's the case, what does trade look like? What does not, because it's not just the economy of the village and that community that's impacted, because that impact is happening, reverberating in all aspects, locally and globally. And so while this is changing in the local space, it's also changing in 100 different local spaces, all of which are going to have an impact on the basis, just the essence of the idea of trade, let's say.
So, because earlier we had a couple of architects here and who were talking about complex systems and the importance of, and earlier I think we were also talking about the issue of complexity and how important it is. At the same time, there's, I would say, a plea towards simplicity. It was very interesting, the sort of meandering between these two words. And you just mentioned complex systems. How do you see this when you're doing your world building between complexity, complex systems, and simplicity and simple solutions?
I think our job as world builders is to turn complexity into comprehension. And I think the reason we keep coming back to this idea of storytelling is it places the human at the center. And if your metaphor and your narrative essentially comes down to the day-to-day of a human story, the difference perhaps, and the thing that certainly wakes our students up, and mostly our clients too, is that there is no single narrative. There's no possibility of a single voice telling a story for the future, particularly now. And so when you bring 20, 30, 50, 100 voices to the table, and they have to focus on individual occupants inside that story space, it's a massively complex system, but at the same time, it's comprehensible because we see it through a human lens on the ground. We understand what it means to be an elderly disabled person who's just lost their wife and has to cross the valley with a transportation system that's completely redundant or not capable of of satisfying your needs to see your grandchildren, whatever it may be. You can drill down into stories that are completely empathetic and yet represent complex data.
I like that. And I want to change tacks for just a minute and come back to world building and how you do it. Because I think you are, in my opinion, one of the best in the world, if not the best in the world. And how do you go about beginning to think about a new world? Do you sit down at breakfast and eat some granola and say, okay, this is going to be red and this is going to be blue? And how do you begin to do this?
Well, we begin by saying we know nothing. And then we say, okay, let's try and discover what's going to be relevant to the other very important piece, which is what is our provocation? What's our primary lens? So when we were working with Volvo, we were asked, what if Volvo didn't manufacture cars anymore? In 30 years, they manufactured safety. And that disrupts everything about the preconceived notion of what is a car company when you can say, go ahead, sorry.
Manufacturing has missed that in the sound. So no cars, they were manufacturing
Safety.
safety. Okay.
And for Volvo, who have a tradition of safety being almost paramount, certainly over aesthetics,
For sure.
and they've designed safety glass and the car seat and the seat belt and those. So you can legitimately say that actually what they're really doing is constantly manufacturing devices to create more safety in the world. So if you separate that from four wheels and you say all of these resources and capabilities in the design and manufacturing and systems that they evolve, if you were to apply that to communities where you can't drive a car, for example, which is what we set in place for them as provocations, is let's look at Volvo's role in Jakarta, where you can't walk down the street, let alone drive down the street. How do you reconsider Volvo's role if their capability is considered to be safety? And then it completely changes the framework by which you could re-examine manufacturing. And in that case, if you say 30 years, you can imagine the conditions of some of those cities extrapolated forward, really putting pressure on what safety means. At the same time, and I think this is the other piece of it, is that we spend at least a third of the time of developing any project on research. And all of these stories, although they're absolutely fictional, because anything from this moment forward, in LA, there could be an earthquake and all story changes, or a pandemic in a global, whatever it is. So it's all fiction, but we're always referring back to conditions that we understand and then extrapolating them forward. And we're doing it in this holistic mandala, which says the sort of butterfly effect. Anything that you discover in ecology is going to reverberate through governance and economy and infrastructure and culture. And all of those points in space have an influence on each other. And so the starting point is map that information that you're gathering to the specific questions that you're being asked, like, what if you didn't build cars anymore? Adding to that a series of lenses, like, let's look at different cities. And each of those cities is a very specific set of conditions. So those lenses for each city put different kind of pressure on the way the world develops. But once you've got that foundation of knowledge and well-informed.
So that makes sense to me. And what do you do when you're looking forward about evolution in technology or science? Because we had Marcus here this morning, who was, positing, well, actually, we really don't know what will be invented 3 years from now. The world could change. So are you going to make, so how do you account for that in your science? Is it just magic, or is it, or in your world, or how do you do that?
Uh, I mean, I think we play with the freedom that storytelling gives you, first of all, I think, to say, let's provoke ourselves to think about things in a more radical way. So you have a chance to say, what if something has really changed radically? But I lost my thread a little bit. I would say that one of the fundamental necessities is that.
Sorry to interrupt. Did you stepping out for food? Did you want anything?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much.
We'll be right back.
Okay. Is that you need the range of expertise that is going to give you a much broader view than you would expect within any particular, the starting point of, I'm looking at the future of engineering. We're bringing in experts from a very broad range of different skill sets or different disciplines, so that the pressure we're putting on those questions that are being asked are always being considered from multiple viewpoints. So there's a lot of stress being put on the narrative, and you're. Oh, and I was going to say, sorry, that and the thing that you can say, regardless of how fast and how unexpected and how unpredictable our near future and distant future is, the constant is going to be the human. That the thing that changes not at all is our well, I will just say our stupidity in the best possible way. That like our our biggest advantage is that we make mistakes all the time, and
So
but we do so constantly.
So let me pick up on that for a moment. So thanks again, Alex. So our stupidity, one of the things that we think of very often, we're hearing more and more in sort of, if you will, in our world and foresight world, is trying to bring the voice of nature, the voice of other actors into the story. And so you said, well, one of your magic things is to focus on the human, or focus on the character. You said the character of the human. How are you seeing this, and how has your view of this evolved, or is it evolving in the typology of characters you need to incorporate?
Well, you raised the absolute perfect point, which is that it's not just the human character, it's the characters of the environment and the way in which all of those things that are a constant or can be tracked reliably, the evolution of the ecology is a very important factor in understanding how to simplify the story, because you can drill down into direct impact of climate change or sea level rise or melt or evolution of plant types in a way that can be tracked reliably. And the interface with that, when we still come back to the human lens, because that's the thing that we, in our egocentric way, see everything through.
Yeah. So Alex, I know we just have a few more minutes. We're creating some stories. You're a master storyteller. Are there certain things you would suggest to us that we should take into consideration as we're crafting the stories and the presentation of our stories tomorrow to the community, to each other? Do you have a couple of tricks which you always tell your classes, or now you have a class of people from 100 from around the world and lots from the village? What would you tell us? What are some of your tricks? Words of wisdom.
There's a word that I'm using increasingly, which I'm not sure how much it's something that you're already using, which is psychogeography. And
Psychogeography.
What that
Psychogeography.
psychogeography, it's the sort of geolocated emotion. And what it says is that although we're bound by time, space, our true narrative is based on our opinion and our emotional connection to place and to event and to moment in time. And so if you, as storytellers, were to say, I'm following the path of somebody from A to B through a day or through what, you know, a certain distance, what I'm really interested in is what my particular character is reacting to. And if we imagine ourselves walking through a city or a town, what we're really doing is we're getting flashes of comprehension based on an absolutely individual set of constraints and lenses and frames, because it's my view walking down the street and yours, if we compared notes at the other end of the street, we might have been in different cities to all intents and purposes, because we're looking through a human lens and through an emotional and empathetic lens. And I think that that's something that when you come down to, first of all, the idea of a street corner, which I think is a metaphor we use a lot, which says, let's bring it down to a scale that we can understand. So we can go, okay, here's global context, but local is the context by which we can feel ourselves standing in that street. And that's a metaphor. It could be at any scale, but at a level of detail that we can understand the moving parts. And then we say, okay, let's place ourselves in that world, walk down that street and see what it is that's important to us as we do that, as we negotiate that pathway. And I think the psychogeography part is that it doesn't, it absolutely acknowledges that time and space are constant, if you like. You know, we are going to be doing this at a certain moment in time, and we're going to be able to be geolocated. But what's actually happening in that place and that time is always through our human lens, and that is unique. And I think one of the reasons that bringing a large group of people together around a story space within the constrained set of questions that you're asking is that it's all of those different viewpoints in that, you know, all those psychogeographies that are intermingling that are actually creating a narrative that's truly reflective. And if you then say, okay, well, let's do that in a fictional space, my students have to place themselves on a street that they've created 300 years in the future, bears no relation to anything that they know, except that they've built it to such a level of detail that they now know it, that they're inside it. And at that point, they can follow pathways of imagination that are grounded in a reality that they've created, if that makes sense. So you can take that psychogeography and you can set it down in 1 year, 10 years, 20 years, and you're just putting a different set of different kinds of pressure points, I suppose, or a different context for the kind of stories you're telling.
That's really fantastic. Thank you. I haven't heard that before. Psychogeography, I really can resonate with that a lot, and I think that's really quite cool. So, as you are a world builder, and thank you for that. I think that's actually quite helpful for me, at least for us. That was really intriguing. What about your future? And when you look at the future, well, we're all here thinking a lot about this right now in the next, say, 10, 20, 30 years with the changing world in front of us. How do you write your story and your narrative of the future? How do you see this for yourself?
Well, I would say that I see it entirely depending on the questions that I'm being asked, if you like. So I don't, as a designer, I'm trying to create a narrative space that will provide answers within a specific set of questions being asked. So the numbers of possible futures are kind of infinite, but what really matters is what it is you're trying to learn. And so those provocations of of the Volvo one, or what is the future of education for Indigenous people, or how do you create a radio station for dispossessed youth in Northern Ireland that allows them to have a new voice that creates a new community and a new labor force for the creative industries, which is a project we're doing in Northern Ireland. You're saying, well, here's a very specific set of constraints. You've got the Troubles, you've got 400 years of history of divisive battle between the Protestant Catholic communities to the extent that they don't step outside of those communities. How do you create a new narrative that allows a completely different perspective for a future that makes it feasible for those communities to come together? And so in that case, we're saying, well, what is the tool? And the I'm getting a little down in the weeds, but what we've decided to do was to ask them to create a radio station, because the radio station doesn't see the color orange, for example, which is a dangerous color to be considering. But it allows them to be absolutely collaborative and understand the intricacies of a creative industry, and create stories in the creation of the platform to make the stories. I think all of that is to say that the important thing for me always as a designer is there has to be a tangible outcome. What you're building is a future set of tools, or a future platform, or a future environment that is experiential and that is actually going to create change by allowing people to step inside it and reconsider their relationship to the world.
Alex, that's the perfect place to wrap up, because we're also at our time, which we agreed. I want to thank you very, very much for making the time and rearranging your schedule, and so that we could chat today. I think this has been very useful for me. I hope for you too. And I want to thank you so much. And we wish you all the very, very best, and all the best of success. And we can't wait to see you here next year. Right?
Me too.
That's where you are, right there, right? All right. Thanks, Alex.
I'm very sorry not to be there today. Thanks.